Keanu Reeves stood beside Sandra Bullock in her hardest time. The hall was quiet. Cameras had stopped flashing, and the crowd that once cheered for Sandra Bullock now seemed like shadows fading away. She had just received news that shook her deeply. A personal loss, a betrayal of trust, and the crushing weight of the world's expectations had all arrived together like a storm. She stood on stage, smiling for the audience, but her heart was breaking. Behind the curtain, Keanu Reeves watched her. He could sense the heavy silence hidden under her forced laughter. Keanu had known pain, and he knew the look of someone who was holding too much inside. It was the same look he had carried when he lost his loved ones. He knew what it meant to walk into a room full of light while carrying darkness inside. That evening, after the event ended, Sandra sat alone in her dressing room. Her phone kept buzzing. Reporters outside kept calling her name, and the walls felt like they were closing in. She buried her face in her hands, whispering to herself that maybe she was not strong enough to carry all of this anymore. Just then, the door opened slowly. No sound of footsteps, no rush of words, just a gentle presence. Keanu walked in holding 2 cups of tea. He placed one beside her without saying anything. Sandra looked up, surprised to see him there. But what touched her most was that he didn't come with questions, advice, or pity. He simply came to sit. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence was heavy, but in that silence was comfort. Sandra felt a strange calm knowing she wasn't alone in that room. Keanu finally spoke in his soft, steady voice. "You don't need to pretend in front of me. If you feel like breaking, break. If you feel like crying, cry. I'll stay." Those words pierced through her guard. Tears began to fall down her face, tears she had held back for days. She tried to hide them, but Keanu gently shook his head. "Let them come," he said, and for the first time in a long while, Sandra allowed herself to be vulnerable. The night stretched on. She told him about the betrayal that shattered her trust, about the fear of losing her career's shine, about the loneliness that followed her even in crowded rooms. Keanu listened, not as a star, not as someone with answers, but as a human being who knew what it was to be broken. Every word she spoke seemed to lift a little weight off her chest. Then came a moment of silence, and Keanu shared something she never expected. He told her about his own nights of grief, about how he would sit in empty apartments, surrounded by silence that screamed louder than any noise. He told her that healing was never about forgetting, but about choosing to move forward even when it hurt. As she listened, Sandra felt a shift inside. She realized she wasn't speaking to someone who was trying to fix her. She was speaking to someone who had already walked through fire and still managed to stand. Later, when Sandra stepped outside the building, the reporters were still there. The flash of cameras was harsh and questions cut like knives, but this time she didn't walk out alone. Keanu walked beside her. His calm presence was like a shield, and though he didn't say a word to the crowd, his quiet strength told the world everything. In that moment, Sandra learned a lesson she would carry forever. Strength doesn't always mean standing tall on your own. Sometimes true strength is allowing someone to stand beside you when your legs are too weak. That night marked the beginning of a bond between 2 souls who understood pain and resilience. A bond built not on fame, not on glamour, but on the simple act of kindness. And as Sandra closed her eyes to rest for the first time in days, she whispered to herself that maybe, just maybe, the hardest times also reveal the purest hearts. The world had moved on quickly, as it always does. Tabloids shifted their focus to another celebrity scandal, and the endless stream of headlines no longer carried Sandra's name. But inside her heart, the storm was still raging. Every morning she woke up with the same heaviness, a weight that no amount of makeup or smiles could hide. She had always been strong, or at least that's what people believed. She had faced years of competition, the pressure of Hollywood, and the constant judgment from strangers who thought they knew her life. But this time the wound was deeper. This was not just about career, it was about trust. Someone she had let close had broken her in a way she didn't know how to repair. Keanu knew this pain. He saw it in her eyes every time they crossed paths. He remembered those same sleepless nights when he himself had sat by a window, watching the city lights flicker, but feeling no warmth in them. He remembered what it felt like to wake up each day and wonder if it was worth getting out of bed. So he decided something. He would not let her fight this battle alone. One afternoon, when Sandra was trying to drown her thoughts in endless rehearsals, she heard a knock on her door. It was gentle, not the impatient kind that demanded entry. When she opened it, she found Keanu standing there with his old motorcycle helmet in hand. His smile was quiet but steady. "Come with me," he said. She hesitated. The weight of her sadness had made her world so small, shrinking her life to dressing rooms and silent car rides home. But something about the way he said it felt different. It wasn't an invitation. It was a lifeline. Minutes later, she found herself sitting behind him on his motorcycle, the city rushing past like waves of light. The wind brushed against her face, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a piece of freedom. The roads twisted and turned, and she held on to him, not out of fear, but because she needed to remind herself that she was still connected to life. Keanu drove them far from the noise of the city, up into the hills where the air was cleaner and the stars felt closer. When they stopped, Sandra took off her helmet and looked around. There were no flashing cameras, no crowds, just silence and a wide-open sky. "Why here?" she asked softly. Keanu leaned on the motorcycle and looked at the horizon. "Because when the world feels too heavy, sometimes you need to see how big the sky is. It reminds you that pain is not the whole story." Sandra felt her throat tighten. She wanted to speak, but words wouldn't come. Instead, tears slipped down her cheeks again, quiet and uninvited. Keanu didn't look away. He didn't try to stop her. He just stood close enough so she knew she wasn't invisible. After a while, he told her a story. It wasn't about Hollywood or fame or money. It was about a night when he was younger, after he had lost someone he loved. He told her how he had stood on a rooftop staring at the sky, wondering if he had the strength to go on, and how in that silence he realized that maybe life wasn't asking him to be strong all at once. Maybe it was only asking him to take one step at a time. Sandra listened, every word soaking into her like rain on dry ground. She realized that the strength she thought she had lost was not gone. It was waiting for her to find it again. They sat there until the stars filled the sky. No headlines, no noise, no masks. Just two souls carrying scars, teaching each other that brokenness does not mean the end. When Keanu dropped her back at her home that night, she didn't feel fully healed, but she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. As she closed her door, she whispered to herself, "I can keep going." But what she didn't know yet was that the road ahead would test her even more. She would face moments where the past came back like a shadow, and moments where even Keanu's quiet strength would be challenged. Because sometimes healing doesn't come in straight lines. Sometimes it comes in storms that break you before they rebuild you. And deep inside, both Keanu and Sandra sensed that the real test was yet to come. The days that followed were quieter, but inside Sandra's heart there was still a war. She had found some hope during the ride with Keanu, yet every morning when she looked in the mirror, the weight of her wounds returned. The betrayal she had faced wasn't something she could simply let go. It lingered in her chest like a hidden thorn. Keanu noticed it whenever they spoke. He could tell when she forced a smile, when her laughter carried just a little too much effort. He never called it out, never embarrassed her by pointing at her pain, but he stayed close. He began to show up at unexpected moments, not to invade her life, but to remind her she was not alone. Sometimes it was just a note slipped under her door that said, "Don't forget you matter." Sometimes it was him leaving a small box of her favorite tea on her kitchen counter. But one evening, Sandra faced her hardest test yet. A gala was being held downtown, and she was expected to appear. She dreaded the event because she knew the very person who had betrayed her would be there. Her heart trembled at the thought of seeing that face again, of pretending in front of everyone that she wasn't shattered inside. As she prepared for the event, she almost called it off. She sat on the edge of her bed, dress untouched, makeup undone, whispering, "I can't do this." Just then, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Keanu. It read, "Strength doesn't always mean fighting alone. If you need me, I'll be there." She paused, staring at the message. It wasn't commanding, it wasn't pressure, it was choice. And in that moment, she chose to rise. Later that night, when she stepped into the gala, the lights were blinding, the air heavy with perfume and judgment. Every corner carried whispers. Every smile felt like a blade. And then, across the hall, her eyes landed on the one person she had hoped not to see. The betrayal hit her again like fresh fire. Her hands shook, her throat tightened, and she nearly turned back. But before she could, a calm hand rested gently on her shoulder. Keanu stood there, dressed simply, not trying to outshine anyone, but carrying a presence that silenced the noise around him. He gave her a small nod as if to say, "You are not alone." Together, they walked into the hall. The whispers grew. Some eyes rolled, some lips curled in envy, but Sandra found strength in each step. Yet the night was not easy. As the music played and conversations flowed, she felt her betrayer's gaze burning into her from across the room. At one point, Sandra excused herself and went to the balcony to breathe. The city lights sparkled below, but her eyes blurred with tears. She felt anger, hurt, and shame all at once. She whispered to herself, "Why wasn't I enough? Why did they do this to me?" Keanu joined her quietly. He didn't touch her, didn't interrupt her storm. After a long silence, he said something that cut through the night. "Sometimes people break us, not because we are weak, but because they don't know how to value strength. Your worth was never measured by what they did to you. Your worth is in who you are, and no one can take that away." Sandra turned to him, her face streaked with tears. She searched his eyes for doubt, but found only truth. At that moment, she realized Keanu wasn't speaking only to her. He was speaking from his own scars. She knew he had been broken too, and that was why his words carried weight. The night ended with Sandra standing taller than she thought she could. She didn't confront her betrayer, she didn't cause a scene, but she walked back into the hall with her head high. For her, that was victory enough. Yet the story was far from over, because resilience is not built in one night. Pain has a way of returning, testing the same wounds again and again. And soon, Sandra would be pushed to face something even harder, an unexpected test that would shake. Both her and Keanu, in ways neither of them had prepared for, Sandra thought the hardest part was behind her after that night at the gala. She had faced her betrayer, she had walked into the fire, and she had survived. But life has a way of testing us again just when we believe we can breathe. A week later, her world was shaken in a different way. She had been scheduled for a major interview, one meant to celebrate her achievements, but the host blindsided her. Instead of focusing on her work, they brought up the betrayal, asking sharp, cruel questions, framing her as weak, framing her as someone who had lost control of her own life. Sandra froze under the lights. The cameras were rolling, and her heart felt like it was being cut open in front of millions. Her hands trembled, her lips struggled to form answers. She wanted to scream, but silence caught her throat. Backstage, Keanu had been waiting. He was there not as a guest, not as part of the show, but as a friend who promised to never leave her standing alone. When he saw her break on live television, something inside him stirred. He remembered all the times the world had misjudged him, the moments he was mocked for his quietness, when people turned his kindness into weakness. He knew that pain, and he could not let her bear it alone. As soon as the interview ended, Sandra walked off stage, holding back tears. The crowd clapped, but their claps sounded like knives. She rushed into the hallway, almost running, trying to escape. And there he was, Keanu leaning against the wall, waiting. He didn't ask if she was okay because he knew she wasn't. Instead, he simply opened his arms. For a moment, Sandra resisted. She hated feeling weak. She hated letting anyone see her break. But when she saw the look in his eyes, steady, patient, without judgment, she let go. She fell into his arms, shaking, her tears soaking into his shirt. "They made me feel small," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You are not small," Keanu replied softly, his hand steady on her back. "You are stronger than they will ever understand, but you don't have to prove it to them. You only have to keep moving forward." Those words didn't erase her pain, but they gave her something to hold on to. Later that night, they went for a quiet walk along the empty streets. The city that usually roared was calmer, as if it respected their silence. Sandra asked him why he always showed up, why he never seemed to tire of carrying her pain alongside her own. Keanu stopped walking and looked at her with a seriousness that went beyond words. "Because I know what it feels like to wish someone had stayed," he said. "I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I would be that person for someone else." Those words struck her deeper than anything else. She realized then that his kindness was not casual. It came from wounds, from loss, from promises made in the quiet hours of his own grief. Days passed, and Sandra slowly began to rebuild. She took on small roles, projects that allowed her to feel joy again. But healing is never a straight line. Sometimes the past came back like whispers in the night. Sometimes her hands still shook before stepping into the public eye. And every time, Keanu was there, not fixing, not forcing, just standing steady. But one evening, as they sat in a small cafe far from the city, Sandra confessed something that changed everything. "Keanu," she said softly, her hands around a warm cup of coffee, "I don't know if I can ever trust again. Not just people in general, but even myself. I feel like I failed. Like I didn't see the truth until it was too late." Keanu took a long breath. He didn't rush to respond because he knew her words were heavy. Finally, he leaned closer and said, "Trust isn't about never falling. It's about choosing to rise even when you've been pushed down. It's about giving yourself permission to be human." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't just from pain. They were from the recognition of something she had forgotten, her own humanity. And then, just as Sandra began to feel a little lighter, life struck again with another twist. A sudden phone call came that night, carrying news neither of them expected. It was about someone from Sandra's past, someone tied to her betrayal, who was now making public claims that threatened to ruin everything she had rebuilt. This time, the storm would not only test Sandra, it would test Keanu as well, forcing him to step out of the shadows of his quiet support and into the harsh light of confrontation. The calm before the storm was over. The real storm was about to begin. The phone call that night left Sandra shaken. She sat frozen on the couch, the voice of her old manager still echoing in her ears. The man who had betrayed her trust was now using the media to twist the story, painting himself as the victim, painting her as the careless one. He had powerful contacts, and in Hollywood, lies often traveled faster than truth. Her hands trembled as she held the phone. "He's going to ruin me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Keanu sat across from her, his face calm, but his eyes steady with fire. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "He cannot ruin you, Sandra. The only person who has the power to end your story is you. Don't give him that power." But deep inside, Sandra felt the old fear rising again. The same fear that had made her cry alone in dressing rooms. The same fear that told her she wasn't strong enough. The next morning, headlines confirmed her dread. Her betrayer had given interviews, painting her as unstable, difficult, and ungrateful. The media loved it. Articles spread like wildfire, and strangers online filled comment sections with cruel words. Sandra stayed inside, blinds drawn, barely able to breathe. She felt the walls closing in as though the whole world had turned against her. Keanu didn't leave her side. When she wouldn't eat, he cooked simple meals and placed them by her. When she wouldn't sleep, he sat with her in silence until exhaustion finally closed her eyes. He knew he couldn't shield her from the storm, but he could remind her she wasn't facing it alone. Then came a night that changed everything. Sandra had been scrolling through endless comments, reading strangers mocking her pain, when suddenly she slammed her phone onto the floor. Her body shook as she whispered, "I can't do this anymore. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am weak." The room was silent for a moment, and then Keanu moved closer. He knelt in front of her, his eyes locked on hers. "Listen to me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You are not weak. You are human. You've given so much to this world, to the people who watch your films, to the friends who love you. One man's lies do not define you. Do you hear me? They do not define you." Her tears fell freely, but something in his words reached her. Keanu rarely raised his voice, but in that moment, his conviction broke through the fog in her mind. He then told her something he had never shared with anyone publicly. He spoke about the darkest night of his life, when grief had nearly taken him under. He told her about how he almost gave up, how he thought he had nothing left to live for. And then, with raw honesty, he said, "What saved me was not strength. It was kindness. One person showed me kindness when I needed it most. And now, I want to be that for you." Sandra's heart broke at his confession, but it also healed something inside her. She realized that Keanu wasn't standing beside her out of pity. He was standing there because he knew her pain, because he understood it in ways no one else could. The next morning, Sandra made a decision. She would not run anymore. If her betrayer wanted to spread lies, she would face them with truth. But she would not do it with anger or revenge. She would do it with honesty, with grace, and with the strength that came from knowing she wasn't alone. When she walked into the press conference days later, the room was crowded with flashing cameras, hungry reporters, and restless whispers. She felt her knees tremble, but then she glanced to the side. Keanu was there, seated quietly, his presence steady and unshaken. He gave her a small nod, the same nod he had given her at the gala, and suddenly, her fear turned into resolve. She stepped up to the microphone, and for the first time in weeks, she spoke without hiding. Her voice was calm, her words clear. She admitted that she had been hurt, that betrayal had shaken her, but she reminded everyone that being human was not a weakness. "I will not let lies decide my story," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "I have faced pain, but I will rise, not because I am perfect, but because I am human, and humans are stronger than we realize." The room fell silent. Even the reporters who came to tear her down lowered their eyes. At that moment, Sandra's courage shone brighter than the flashes of the cameras. But as the press conference ended and the weight began to lift from her shoulders, a new challenge emerged. Her betrayer, furious at her boldness, was not finished. He had allies, and he was preparing something bigger, something that could strike harder than before. This battle was not over. It was only beginning. The days after the press conference were a mix of relief and fear. Relief, because Sandra had finally spoken her truth in front of the world. Fear, because she knew her betrayer would not give up so easily. Behind the cameras and the headlines, he was preparing his final strike. Rumors began to spread again, this time uglier than before. Secret recordings, fabricated documents, stories planted in magazines that tried to tear apart everything Sandra had rebuilt. People she thought were friends stayed silent, afraid to take her side. The betrayal was no longer just personal. It had become a war for her dignity. Sandra sat in her living room one night, exhausted and pale. "I don't know how much more I can take," she whispered. "Every time I stand, he finds a way to push me back down." Keanu looked at her with the same calm he had carried from the beginning. But now his voice was stronger, sharper, almost fierce. "He wants you to break, Sandra. He thinks if he throws enough shadows, you will forget that you are the light. But you are not alone anymore. If he wants to fight, he is not just fighting you. He is fighting me too." She looked at him, eyes wide, realizing how far he had gone for her. "Why, Keanu?" she asked softly. "Why do you keep standing beside me?" His answer was simple. "Because when someone you care about is drowning, you don't ask why. You just dive in." Those words gave her the strength to face the storm one last time. The final confrontation came during a live charity event where both Sandra and her betrayer had been invited. The organizers hadn't planned it this way. It was coincidence or maybe fate. The moment Sandra stepped onto the stage to speak about kindness and resilience, her betrayer appeared in the audience, smirking. Ready to stir chaos, he began whispering to reporters, spreading his lies again, hoping to overshadow her moment. Sandra felt the familiar panic rise in her chest. Her hands shook, her breath grew short. She could almost hear his voice in her head, mocking her. But then she looked to the side. Keanu was there, seated quietly, but his eyes were locked on hers, steady and unshaken. And in that moment, she remembered every word he had spoken, every time he had lifted her when she fell. Sandra straightened her back, gripped the microphone, and spoke. Not just to the audience, not just to the cameras, but to herself. "I have been hurt," she said, her voice strong. "I have been betrayed, but I refuse to let betrayal decide my worth. I stand here today because kindness stood beside me when cruelty tried to break me. And I want the world to know this. Strength is not about never falling. Strength is about rising again and again, no matter who tries to push you down. The hall fell silent. Even her betrayer froze, his smirk fading. Her words carried a truth that could not be twisted. The crowd rose in applause, some with tears in their eyes, others moved by the raw honesty of her heart. And through it all, Keanu stood walking quietly to the stage, not to take the spotlight but to stand beside her. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was a story of loyalty, of kindness, of a man who refused to let someone he cared about walk through pain alone. That night changed everything. The lies lost their power. The headlines shifted, and people saw Sandra not as a victim but as a survivor. Her betrayer faded into the background, his attempts drowned out by the strength of her truth. Later, when the crowd was gone and the night was still, Sandra and Keanu sat outside under the stars. She looked at him with tears, but this time they weren't from pain. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Keanu shook his head gently. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to keep living, keep shining. That's enough." In that moment, Sandra realized the depth of his kindness. He wasn't there for recognition. He wasn't there for applause. He was there because that's who he was. And that was what made his presence so powerful. From then on, Sandra's life began a new chapter. The scars of betrayal remained, but they no longer controlled her. She walked with dignity, knowing she had faced the storm and survived. And every time she looked back on those darkest nights, she remembered one truth. Sometimes the greatest gift life gives us is not answers, but people who choose to stand beside us when the world turns away. And for Sandra, that person was Keanu Reeves.